I still remember the night vividly, even though it happened years ago when I was in high school. It was supposed to be a fun weekend with friends, a break from the monotony of school life, but it turned into something far more sinister, an experience that haunts me to this day. It all started on a Friday evening in late October. The air was crisp with the first signs of winter, and the leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way to Mike's house. Mike had the idea to go camping in the woods just outside of town. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to celebrate the start of our senior year. There were 5 of us: Mike, Tom, Jess, Ashley, and me. We'd all been friends since freshman year. And this trip was something we had been planning for months. Mike's parents had a large property that bordered a dense forest. They were out of town for the weekend, so we had the place to ourselves. We packed our gear, loaded up on snacks and drinks, and set off just before sunset. The hike to the campsite wasn't long, maybe a mile or 2, but the path was rough and uneven. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in an eerie twilight. We pitched our tents, started a fire, and settled in for the night. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect: roasting marshmallows, telling jokes, and enjoying each other's company. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to ghost stories. It was Ashley who brought up the local legend of the Woodsman, a mysterious figure said to haunt the very forest we were camping in. According to the story, the Woodsman was a hermit who had lived in the forest decades ago. He was known for his temper and his reclusiveness, and it was said that anyone who trespassed on his land would disappear without a trace. We all laughed it off as just another spooky tale meant to scare kids. But as the fire died down and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us seemed to close in, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I shared a tent with Tom, who fell asleep almost immediately. I, on the other hand, lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional crackle of the dying fire were all I could hear. But then, sometime around midnight, I heard something else, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to fall asleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, this time closer. My heart began to race, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I nudged Tom awake and whispered, "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up and listened for a moment before shrugging it off. "It's probably just the wind," he muttered before rolling over and falling back asleep. But I knew it wasn't the wind. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the tent ceiling and trying to calm my racing thoughts. The footsteps came and went throughout the night, never staying in one place for long, always moving, always circling. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the campsite. I crawled out of the tent, my body stiff and sore from the restless night. The others were already up, making breakfast and chatting about the day's plans. I decided not to mention the footsteps, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked deeper into the woods, explored an old, abandoned cabin we stumbled upon, and spent the afternoon swimming in a small, secluded pond we found. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting, and we were all exhausted. We had dinner, talked about school and our futures, and once again, the conversation turned to the Woodsman. This time, it was Tom who brought it up, recounting a story he'd heard from his older brother. According to him, the Woodsman wasn't just a hermit, but a murderer who had killed several people who had wandered into his territory. Their bodies were never found, but it was said that on quiet nights, you could hear their cries for help echoing through the trees. We all laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming and full of adventure during the day, now felt dark and oppressive. As the fire died down, we retreated to our tents once more. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps started earlier, just after we'd all settled in for the night. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. I could hear them circling our campsite, moving closer and then farther away. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle in my body tensed. I could tell from Tom's breathing that he was awake too, though he didn't say anything. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, followed by a low, guttural growl. I sat up, my heart racing, and whispered, "Tom, did you hear that?" He didn't respond, but I could see the outline of his figure, sitting up and straining to listen. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by more footsteps. It sounded like someone, or something, was right outside our tent. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but all I could think of was the woodsman. I reached for the flashlight I had left by my sleeping bag and turned it on, shining it towards the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps had stopped, and the night was eerily silent. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and whispered, "We need to wake the others." Tom nodded, and we cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light across the campsite. I could see the outlines of the other tents, but there was no sign of movement. I motioned for Tom to follow me, and we quietly made our way to Mike's tent. I was about to wake him when I heard the growl again, this time coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. I froze, flashlight in hand, and strained to see what was out there. The beam of light flickered and wavered, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with long matted hair and tattered clothes. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the light from my flashlight. For a moment I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The figure took a step forward, and I snapped out of my trance. "Mikes! Ashley, wake up!" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. The others scrambled out of their tents, confusion and fear etched on their faces. I pointed towards the figure, but when I looked back, it was gone. "What's going on?" Mike asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I saw something, someone, at the edge of the clearing," I stammered. "It was just standing there, watching us." The others exchanged nervous glances, and Tom nodded in agreement. I heard it too. There was a growl and footsteps. It sounded like it was circling our camp. Mike, always the rational one, tried to calm us down. "It's probably just a prank, someone messing with us. Maybe some kids from town heard we were camping out here and decided to scare us." But I knew it wasn't a prank. The fear I had felt was too real, too intense. "We need to leave," I insisted. "Pack up and get out of here." Reluctantly, the others agreed. We quickly gathered our gear, doused the fire, and started the hike back to Mike's house. The forest seemed even darker and more menacing than before. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following us, but the path behind us remained empty. We made it back to Mike's house, just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally, but relieved to be out of the forest. Mike's parents wouldn't be back until the next day, so we all crashed in the living room, too tired to talk about what had happened. That afternoon, we finally discussed the events of the night before. Mike still believed it was a prank, but Tom and I were convinced that something more sinister was at play. Jess and Ashley were shaken, but they didn't have any explanations either. The rest of the weekend passed uneventfully, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. The image of the figure at the edge of the clearing haunted my dreams, and the sound of footsteps echoed in my mind. Years have passed since that night, but the experience still lingers in my memory. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know that what I saw and heard was real. The forest may seem peaceful and inviting during the day, but when the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, it becomes a different place. A place where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and where the woodsman still watches from the darkness. To this day, I avoid that forest. I've heard other stories from people who've had similar experiences, but I've never gone back to see for myself. Some things are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved. All I know is that the woodsman is out there, somewhere, and that the forest will never be the same for me again.
The night I will never forget. Hi everyone, I've been a lurker on this subreddit for a while, enjoying the scary stories you all share. I never thought I'd have one of my own to tell, but here I am. This is a true story from my high school days, and even now, years later, it haunts me. I'll do my best to recount every detail as vividly as possible. It's long, but please bear with me. It all began during my junior year of high school. I lived in a small town where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and any semblance of excitement was rare. My friends and I, always on the lookout for something thrilling to do, often found ourselves trying to come up with new ways to entertain ourselves. There were 4 of us, me, Emily, Sarah, Chloe, and Rachel. We'd been friends since middle school, and our bond was tight. We did everything together, from homework to sleepovers. One night, as we sat around a bonfire in Sarah's backyard, we started talking about the old house on the outskirts of town. It was a dilapidated mansion, rumored to be haunted. The stories varied. Some said a family had been murdered there, others claimed it was once a mental asylum. We'd all heard the rumors, but none of us had ever dared to visit. Sarah, always the boldest of us, suggested we check it out. The idea was met with nervous laughter and hesitant agreement. It was a chilly October night, perfect for a creepy adventure. We decided to go the following Friday, when Rachel's parents would be out of town, giving us the perfect excuse to have a sleepover at her place. The days leading up to our adventure were filled with a mix of excitement and dread. We gathered flashlights, snacks, and anything else we thought we might need. When Friday finally came, we met at Rachel's house, giddy with anticipation. By the time we set out, it was already dark. The walk to the old mansion took about half an hour, but it felt much longer in the cold night air. The house loomed in the distance, an imposing silhouette against the moonlit sky. As we approached, the details came into view: broken windows, ivy creeping up the walls, and a front door hanging off its hinges. It was every bit as creepy as the stories had made it out to be. We stood at the gate, staring up at the house. "Are we really doing this?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with excitement. "Of course. Come on, it's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" We all laughed nervously and followed her through the gate. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the path to the door was barely visible. As we stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under our feet, and the air was thick with dust and decay. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness. The interior was even more unsettling than the outside. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris. Old furniture was scattered about, covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked as if the place had been abandoned for decades, untouched by time. We started exploring, sticking close together. The first floor was mostly empty rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. We found an old kitchen, a dining room with a long, dusty table, and a living room with a grand fireplace. There was something oddly beautiful about the decay, like a glimpse into a forgotten past. As we made our way upstairs, the atmosphere grew heavier. The steps creaked ominously and the air grew colder. The second floor was lined with bedrooms, each one more eerie than the last. In one room, we found an old, dusty dollhouse, its tiny furniture eerily arranged as if someone had just been playing with it. In another, a large ornate mirror stood cracked and broken, reflecting our pale, anxious faces. It was in the last bedroom that things took a turn for the worse. The room was smaller than the others, with a single bed and a wardrobe against the wall. As we entered, I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The others must have felt it too, because they all shivered and looked around uneasily. "Let's get out of here," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place is giving me the creeps." Sarah, always the stubborn one, shook her head. "Come on, we've made it this far. Let's at least check out the attic. There might be something cool up there." Reluctantly, we agreed and followed her to the attic door. It was a small wooden door at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. Sarah tried the handle, but it was locked. Undeterred, she rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a bobby pin. "Where did you learn to pick locks?" Rachel asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah grinned. "YouTube." It took a few minutes, but she finally managed to unlock the door. The hinges creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. We hesitated for a moment before Sarah started up the stairs, and we followed close behind. The attic was a large, open space filled with old furniture, trunks, and boxes. The air was even colder up there, and the smell of dust and decay was overwhelming. We spread out, each of us exploring different parts of the attic. I found an old trunk filled with moth-eaten clothes, while Chloe discovered a stack of yellowed newspapers. It was Rachel who found the journal. She was rummaging through an old desk when she pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "Hey guys, check this out," she called, holding it up. We gathered around her as she opened the journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The entries were dated from the early 1900s, and they told the story of a young girl named Lillian who had lived in the house. As Rachel read aloud, the story unfolded. Lillian had been a lonely child, her parents distant and cold. She wrote about strange noises she heard at night, about feeling watched and followed. The entries grew darker as the days went on, filled with fear and paranoia. She wrote about seeing shadows in the corners of her room, about whispers in the darkness. The final entry was the most chilling. Lillian wrote about a figure she had seen in the attic, a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes. She wrote about how it had spoken to her, whispering terrible things. The last line read, "I can't escape. It's always watching." A shiver ran down my spine as Rachel finished reading. The attic suddenly felt much darker, the shadows deeper. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. "This place isn't safe." The others nodded in agreement, and we quickly made our way back down the stairs. As we reached the second floor, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. We froze, our hearts pounding. The sound was followed by footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the front door. "Someone's in here," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We stood there, paralyzed, as the footsteps grew closer. They were heavy and methodical, echoing through the empty house. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Hide," Rachel hissed, and we scrambled into the nearest room, a small bedroom with a large wardrobe. We squeezed inside, the musty smell of old clothes filling our noses. We tried to be as quiet as possible, listening intently to the sounds outside. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, pausing for a moment before continuing down the hallway. They stopped right outside our door, and I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open slowly, and I could see a sliver of light through the crack in the wardrobe door. A shadow fell across the floor, and I bit my lip to keep from crying out. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity before the door slowly closed again. The footsteps continued down the hallway, fading into the distance. We waited for several minutes, hardly daring to breathe. When we were sure the figure was gone, we cautiously stepped out of the wardrobe. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. The others nodded, and we made our way back to the stairs. We moved as quietly as possible, listening for any sign of the intruder. When we reached the front door, we found it wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. We bolted out of the house and ran all the way back to Rachel's, not stopping until we were safely inside. We locked all the doors and windows, huddling together in the living room. No one spoke for a long time, the fear and adrenaline still coursing through our veins. "What was that?" Chloe finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her bravado gone. "But I'm never going back there again." We spent the rest of the night trying to make sense of what had happened, but there were no easy answers. The house, the journal, the figure, none of it made any sense. All we knew was that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. The next day, we decided to do some research. We went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and records, trying to find anything about the house and its history. What we found was chilling. The house had belonged to the Whitaker family, who had moved there in the early 1900s. They had a daughter named Lillian, who was known to be a quiet and withdrawn child. The family lived there for several years until one day they all vanished without a trace. The house was left abandoned, and over the years it fell into disrepair. There were rumors and speculation about what had happened to the Whitakers, but nothing concrete. Some said they had moved away suddenly, while others believed they had met a more sinister fate. The most popular theory was that the house was cursed, that something evil resided within its walls. We never went back to the house, and we never spoke of that night again. It was a silent agreement. an unspoken pact to leave the past behind. But the memory of that night still lingers, a dark shadow in the back of my mind. Years have passed since that night, and we've all gone our separate ways. Sarah moved to the city and became a lawyer. Rachel went to medical school. Chloe started her own business, and I became a writer. But the bond we shared, forged in fear and terror, remains strong. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down I know the truth. There was something in that house, something dark and malevolent, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows. So that's my story. Believe it or not, it's the truth. If you ever find yourself drawn to an old abandoned house, my advice is to stay away. Some places are best left alone, their secrets buried in the past. Because you never know what might be lurking in the darkness, watching and waiting.
The night in the abandoned school. Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be the type to share one of these stories, but after all these years, I need to get this off my chest. It's something that happened when I was in high school, and it still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. I apologize in advance if this gets lengthy, but bear with me. Back when I was a junior, my small town had an old abandoned school on the outskirts. It had been closed down for decades, and there were all kinds of rumors about why. Some said it was due to structural issues, while others believed it was because of a tragic event that had occurred there. As teenagers, the mystery of the old school was irresistible. My friends and I often talked about exploring it, but it was always just talk. That is, until one night in early October, there were 5 of us, me, Mike, Tom, Sarah, and Jenny. We were inseparable back then, always looking for the next adventure or thrill. That night, we were hanging out at Mike's house, bored out of our minds. It was Tom who first brought up the idea of going to the old school. I could see the excitement and fear in everyone's eyes. It was one of those moments where no one wanted to back down and be the coward, so we decided to go for it. We waited until it was well past midnight. Mike's parents were asleep, and we snuck out quietly, trying not to wake them. The walk to the old school was about half an hour, but it felt much longer in the dark. The air was cold, and the sky was overcast, giving the night an eerie, oppressive feeling. When we finally reached the school, it looked even more imposing and sinister up close. The building was a 2-story structure with boarded-up windows and a chain-link fence surrounding it. The fence had a section that had been cut open. Clearly, we weren't the first ones to have this idea. We squeezed through the gap and made our way to the entrance. The door was locked, but Mike, always the resourceful one, had brought along a crowbar. It took some effort, but we managed to pry the door open. The inside of the school was pitch black, and the air was musty and stale. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness. The hallway in front of us was long and lined with lockers, many of which were rusted and dented. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it recent and some of it clearly decades old. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old papers, and who knows what else. We decided to explore the first floor first. We stuck close together, not wanting to get separated. The classrooms we peeked into were mostly empty, some with old desks and chairs strewn about, others completely bare. It was unsettling how the place seemed frozen in time, as if the students and teachers had just up and left one day and never returned. As we made our way down the hallway, we started to hear strange noises. At first, it was just the occasional creak or groan, which we attributed to the old building settling. But then we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from above us. We all stopped and looked at each other, our faces pale in the flashlight beams. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Mike replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "It's probably just an animal or something." We all knew he didn't believe that, but none of us wanted to admit how scared we were. We decided to check out the second floor, partly out of curiosity, and partly to prove to ourselves that we weren't afraid. The stairwell was at the end of the hall, and the steps creaked ominously as we ascended. The second floor was much like the first, long, dark hallways lined with lockers and classrooms, but there was something different about the atmosphere. It felt heavier, more oppressive. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed darker. We split up to explore the classrooms, agreeing to meet back at the stairwell in 10 minutes. Tom and I took one side of the hallway, while Mike, Sarah, and Jenny took the other. The classroom we entered was much like the others, with old desks and chairs scattered about. There was a large chalkboard at the front of the room, covered in faded writing and drawings. Tom and I joked about how creepy it would be if we saw something written on the board, but our laughter was hollow and forced. After a few minutes, we heard a loud crash from the hallway. We rushed out to see what had happened and found Mike, Sarah, and Jenny standing outside a classroom with the door hanging off its hinges. "What the hell happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. "We don't know," Mike said, his face pale. "We were just looking around, and then the door slammed shut and came off its hinges." We all stood there in silence, the fear and tension palpable. That's when we heard the footsteps again, this time coming from down the hall. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking with purpose. We turned our flashlights toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated an empty hallway. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This isn't fun anymore." No one argued with her. We made our way back to the stairwell, but as we reached the top of the stairs, we heard the footsteps again, this time from below us. It sounded like they were coming up the stairs. We froze, our flashlights trained on the darkness below. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "Run!" Tom shouted, and we bolted down the stairs, not caring about the noise we made. We reached the first floor and sprinted down the hallway toward the exit. As we neared the door, we heard the footsteps again, this time running after us. We burst through the door and into the night, not stopping until we were well away from the school. We didn't speak until we were back at Mike's house, breathless and terrified. "What the hell was that?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mike replied, his hands shaking. "But I'm not going back there, ever again." We all agreed. The fear and adrenaline had worn off, leaving us exhausted and shaken. We tried to rationalize what had happened, telling ourselves it was just our imaginations, but deep down, we knew there was something more to it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark hallways and heard the footsteps. I kept thinking about the stories we had heard, about the tragic event that had supposedly taken place at the school. What if it was true? What if something or someone was still there? The next day, we decided to do some research. We went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and records, trying to find anything about the school's history. What we found was chilling. The school had been closed in the 1970s after a series of mysterious disappearances. Several students and a teacher had gone missing over the course of a year, and despite extensive searches, they were never found. There were rumors of a cover-up, of something dark and sinister lurking within the school's walls. The final straw came when the principal himself vanished, leaving behind a cryptic note that simply read, "It's here." After that, the school was shut down, and the building was left to decay. The town moved on, but the legend of the abandoned school remained. Most people dismissed it as just that, a legend. But after what we experienced, we knew there was some truth to it. We tried to put it behind us, but the memory of that night stayed with us. Over the years, we drifted apart, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. Mike moved away for college and never came back. Tom joined the military, hoping the discipline and structure would help him forget. Sarah and Jenny moved to different states, starting new lives and leaving the past behind. As for me, I stayed in our hometown. I couldn't bring myself to leave, as if the answers I sought were still hidden somewhere in that old, abandoned school. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth, spending countless hours researching and interviewing anyone who might know something. One night, several years after our initial visit, I decided to go back. I needed closure, needed to confront whatever it was that haunted me. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I made my way to the school. The fence was still there, the gap we had used to get in, now rusted and overgrown with weeds. The door was still ajar from when we had pried it open all those years ago. The inside of the school was just as I remembered, dark, cold, and foreboding. I made my way to the second floor, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The classroom doors stood open, and the silence was oppressive. I stood at the top of the stairs, the memory of that night flooding back. I could almost hear the footsteps again, feel the fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins. But this time, I was determined to face it. I descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the empty building. When I reached the bottom, I turned and shone my flashlight down the hallway. It was empty, just as it had been all those years ago. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. I turned, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the classroom where the door had come off its hinges. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding. The room was empty, just like the others, but as I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was cold, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. Then I saw it. Written on the chalkboard in large, jagged letters was a single word, leave. I didn't need any more convincing. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the building and back in the safety of my car. I drove home, my mind racing. Whatever was in that school, it didn't want me there. And I was more than happy to oblige. I've never been back to the school since that night. I still think about it sometimes, wondering what might have happened if we had stayed, if we had confronted whatever was haunting that place. But some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved. So that's my story. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's the truth. Take it or leave it. But if you ever find yourself in an old, abandoned building and hear footsteps that shouldn't be there, my advice is to get out. Some things are best left alone.